Hello and welcome to another version of our class. Today we're going to do something a little bit different, and I'm just going to be up here briefly. James Carter is a voice we often hear in the back, but today he's going to be front and center. He's kind of like going from a supporting actor to his own vehicle, kind of like, this is like Jack Black, you know.
I was thinking Oprah to Dr. Phil.
Oh, we could do that too. I was thinking more like Jack Black in School of Rock. This is your big breakthrough role. Anyway, James is going to talk about Vietnam. He's a graduate student. He's been working with me for about 5 or 6 years now, doing really wonderful work. He's finishing his dissertation, which is about, the topic is called Inventing Vietnam. And basically what he's done is show how the United States had to essentially invent a country below the 17th parallel. He's going to talk about this today. There really wasn't an independent South Vietnam. And so the U.S. has to go in and kind of like physically and politically construct it. And it's really outstanding. He's delivered papers and written articles about U.S. foreign policy and has done some really great work. And so we're very fortunate that he's going to talk to us about the Vietnam War in this class. Otherwise, everything is the same. Ask him questions, challenge him, all that kind of stuff. But this is James Carter. So.
All right, there. Very slick handoff, like a seamless tapestry. Thanks for the setup. I am going to be talking about Vietnam. A bit of background before I get into it, though. Anytime I teach Vietnam, whether it's in a survey course or in some other context, I tend to find that students who have an interest in Vietnam, who come to the class with an interest in Vietnam, often have an interest in what is a very, very narrow period of American policy in Vietnam, and that is basically the period of massive war from about 1965 through about 1968 or 70. I tend to treat that later and as only one of many parts of American policy toward Vietnam, and I think that'll become clear as I talk about some of these things. I'm going to dip back into the World War II years and bring us forward. I'll try to be kind of rapid about it, but I think in order to understand what becomes an American war, a full-scale war involving over 1 million troops combined, American and South Vietnamese forces. In order to understand how we get to that point, you need much background. And the more I read and research into this, it's actually that earlier period that becomes much more interesting and much more important to me. And I think that'll also kind of be borne out in the way that I talk about this. So let me begin by saying, and I'll cover some of the ground that Bob has already covered, but let's begin by going back into the 1940s and the Second World War and talk about the kinds of things that are happening, the kind of global events of the late 1930s, early 1940s. As has already been said in here, by the mid-1940s, the old global system, the old balance of power or spheres arrangement has begun to completely come undone. And in fact, it is coming undone in the Second World War. And it has been unraveling since at least the turn of the 20th century. That's a matter of conjecture when exactly that begins to happen. But by the Second World War, that system has collapsed. And it leaves in its wake what I think is, as far as U.S. policymakers are concerned, a really chaotic and perilous global environment. And they're terrified of the realities of the collapse of colonialism with nothing to replace it. Now, on the outline here, I begin by talking about, and I won't do these things necessarily in this order, these first 3 or 4 items. We can start by asking why Vietnam, and it takes us back to about the mid-1940s. Why Vietnam? Why does the U.S. give a damn about Vietnam? Why does Vietnam not just another example like U.S. involvement in Guatemala or Iran or Indonesia? Those don't become large-scale wars for the United States. Vietnam was a little bit different. In this period, Vietnam's attachment to France is critically important. In the same way, the British colonies, in particular in Malaya, are critically important to the British and to American-British relations. So this is kind of a Europe first take. During the Second World War, and this is everybody probably has heard one form of this, but Franklin Roosevelt comes up with this notion of a trusteeship for what used to be colonies. Everybody kind of recognizes that, for the most part, colonies are now going to be, if not independent, they're not going to be colonies anymore. They're going to be something else, some kind of ill-defined entity. Roosevelt imagines that they can be led through from colonialism to some sort of independent status, and using this trusteeship as a vehicle for that. And all that means, really quite simple, all it means is that some collection of greater power states or some world governing body, perhaps the UN or something else, will oversee the transition of colonies to something else. The point of it is, though, that the U.S. does not imagine that former empires are going to recapture their colonies. The U.S. does not want the British to recapture all of its colonies. The U.S. doesn't want the French to recapture all of their colonies, for reasons that should be very, very clear by now, given the previous, 8 weeks in. The U.S. would instead rather have an open world, an open door trading world, or a free trade environment. And colonialism really gets in the way of that. So if Roosevelt is bent on this trusteeship program, this trusteeship scheme for moving colonies away from being colonies to some other thing, why then does that not come to pass? It doesn't come to pass. Very clearly it doesn't come to pass. The U.S. ultimately will end up supporting the British getting back in Malaya, and they'll end up supporting the French getting back in Vietnam. Indochina, and specifically ultimately Vietnam, will be the jewel they try to hang on to. What happens? Why is that the case? Well, part of it is that FDR dies in spring of 1945, and then this idea kind of dies with him. However, it's not entirely that doesn't entirely explain why this happens. I think that officials are kind of overtaken by events, and one of those events has to do with something that Dr. Brzezinko's already talked about at considerable length, is triangular trade in the dollar gap, the fourth item on there, the dollar gap. Actually, I think a diagram might be very useful here. The British, during the Second World War, the British actually used their colonies for dollar earnings, to get their dollars. Colonies are exporting devices, yes? Colonies are designed as exporting entities. That's what they do. They export raw materials, they use their sources of cheap labor, and they export raw materials to manufacturing countries. They earn dollars. Those dollars then go back into the mother country. So let's say, and my map drawing skills are surpassed only by Bob's. Let's say that's Great Britain, this is Malaya, Great Britain, the U.S., right? Perfect. This is how, and this is a very, very crude rendering of how this system works, but Malaya sells whatever it sells, its raw materials. You could just put this same diagram onto any other colony, any other colonial arrangement. In exchange, the U.S. gives dollars to Malaya. Those dollars then go to Great Britain in exchange for, the British are broke in the Second World War, so they send instead promissory notes. They don't have any money, but during, say, from 1944 through the late 1940s, the British will begin to use the money derived from those colonies to purchase goods needed in the United States, right? Again, it's highly simplified, but that's the gist of how this is supposed to work. So the Second World War comes to an end. The U.S. has this notion of transforming what was formerly colonialism into something very, very different. And then they start talking to the British and the French about the possibilities of this. The British are in huge debt. The British rack up tremendous debt, not to other nations. They do that as well, but I'm not talking about that right now. The British rack up huge debt even within what's called the sterling dollar pool, the sterling block. They rack up huge debt. And you can see from this diagram, the British are not paying for their dollars. They're not giving stuff back to Malaya. They're issuing promissory notes. So they go into hundreds and hundreds of $million in debt within their own block. And they can't get out of it. When the war comes to an end, the U.S., part of something that Bob's already talked about, the U.S. forces certain concessions out of the British. One of those is immediate convertibility, per the Bretton Woods system. The U.S. wants everybody's currency to become immediately convertible. And what that'll mean is you can convert, like pound holders, for example, or franc holders can immediately convert to dollars, which is the currency, so they immediately do it. When the U.S. forces convertibility on the British, what do you think happens? What do pound holders immediately do? They unload those pounds. They do it to the tune of $150 million per week. For weeks and weeks and weeks and months this goes on. delivering the pounds and getting dollars back. And there's this, the proverbial giant sucking sound of pulling dollars out of Great Britain, cashing in pounds, getting dollars for that. It creates the dollar gap. Back to this arrangement, back to this kind of triangular trade relationship, the British, when the war is over, have no means of getting dollars. The French have no means of earning dollars. Their colonies had been their big dollar earners. If the U.S. wants them to have some capacity for earning dollars, the U.S. will have to do what? Loan them money, or when the money runs out, which it will, the Marshall Plan will run out. Use the table mics too when you respond. But the other alternative is the U.S. will have to cave on its trusteeship program. The U.S. is going to have to sacrifice that ideal and let the British take their colonies back. That's the idea. This is how, I'm taking a circuitous route, but this is how you answer that big question. Why does the United States end up supporting colonialism? Because all this stuff is much, much more important. The relationship between the United States and its Western European allies, the economic relationship between the handful of Western European nations and the United States, their rebuilding, and the continued reliance on what's called the Third World, or the Global South, for raw materials and free labor. That had been their asset for as long as there had been colonialism. That's the idea. They're not supposed to come manufacturing centers. They're not supposed to be independent. They're supposed to provide raw materials and cheap labor. So the British come knocking. And they find a receptive audience and a couple of people, Dean Acheson among them, very, very, very bright guy, gets all this stuff. Dean Acheson says, this is a quote from 1952. Dean Acheson says, actually I think it's from 1949. He says, quote, "The key commodities on which our most efficient agricultural and manufacturing industries are heavily dependent will be sharply reduced with serious repercussions of our domestic economy if Europe is not bailed out, if Europe doesn't rebuild." So he understands that this is the problem. This is a big, big, big problem. And furthermore, the Marshall Plan is a temporary fix. The Marshall Plan ends in 51, 52, the Marshall Plan ends. When the Marshall Plan ends, this is the big concern. When the Marshall Plan money runs out, the British will have no access to dollars. And so that means that that relationship will run out. They will not be able to continue to buy America's manufactured goods anymore. They'll need a means to continue to that pipeline. They'll need a means to continue to accumulate dollars to get rid of them, to purchase stuff. And the same goes for the French. For this reason, the U.S., and I'll abbreviate this somewhat, the U.S. in the late 1940s and early 1950s begins to purchase large volumes of tungsten, tin, and rubber out of Southeast Asia. More than is needed in some instances, purchasing the stuff and then shipping it out to somewhere else, purchasing the stuff to the detriment of local producers in order to keep up this relationship. So this is a critically important feature of very, very, very early, kind of the genesis of U.S. policy towards Southeast Asia. It's not what they wanted necessarily. It's not what they've been gunning for the past several decades, since 1899 or so. But it's expediency, it's a temporary fix. It's a tin smelter, yeah. Yeah.
They shut it down in Texas because they want to continue to get the tin from Southeast Asia.
Right.
They prefer a foreign corporation
to a domestic producer. Right. That smell. I think that tin. I think it was in Texas City actually. The tin smelter that they shut down in order not to sort of get in the way of this relationship. So yeah, these kind of larger interests are. This is considered much, much, much more vital in terms of global policy and in Western European recovery and blah, blah, blah. All right, so the U.S. begins to make all these purchases. And now consider, this is the same basic relationship whether you're talking about Thailand, Burma, Malaya, Indochina, Indonesia. This same kind of dynamic is taking hold. Not necessarily the same commodities, and some of the details are quite different. But when the French come knocking, what do the French do immediately after the war ends? The French in 1946, they moved to capture Indochina. They'd been booted out of Indochina. It's a tragic story in Indochina between the late 30s and the late 1940s. But Indochina is occupied first by the Japanese. The French, as you recall, were defeated by Germany very, very early in the Second World War. Thus, they lose control of their colonies. That then is basically given over to the Japanese to control, while the Japanese are island hopping to get their own, pool of resources and labor. The French then in 46 move to recapture that colony in Indochina. And they fight what is called do I have it up here? The first Indochina War, I certainly do, yeah. The first Indochina War, 1946 to 54. This is what this is about. In this war, the French are going to come back in and kind of reimpose colonial rule, and they're doing so at a point at which the Vietnamese had begun to assert themselves years and years earlier. So they don't come back in to take over a colony that has kind of just been laying dormant for all these years. There's a vibrant nationalist movement all over the breadth of Vietnam. Ultimately, the French will concede what are Cambodia and Laos, and focus on Vietnam, because Vietnam had been kind of the jewel in the crown, so to speak, for the French colonial arrangement. So the U.S. begins to, in 1950, the U.S. begins to help to fund the French war. The French, like the British, basically offer the U.S. an ultimatum. The U.S. has interests also back in Europe. The U.S., for example, wants the French to be an active and eager participant in NATO, which is on there, I think, yeah, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a Western military pact that is formed after the Second World War. So the U.S. wants very badly for the French to sign on to this pact, and in order to do that, the French are basically saying, it's not quite this simple, but this is the gist of it. The French want U.S. help getting back into its colonies. In 1950, the decision is made. This is typically where talks about U.S. policy in Vietnam kind of take off. 1950 is the point at which the U.S. begins to cut checks. The administration starts out and very meagerly offering $10 million, and then gradually that mushrooms. So that by 1953, and I have the numbers up here as well, by 1953 the U.S. is paying for approaching 80% of the entire cost of getting the French back in their colony. This is exclusively a military effort, so they're paying for the war. This is not some sort of economic development scheme or agricultural reform scheme. This is a war to defeat what the French call resistance, what is in reality Vietnamese nationalism. It depends on your perspective. So, and as you no doubt know if you've taken another course with Bob or you've read a book or two on this, in 1954, things have been going badly for the French, and in May of 1954, the French suffer what is a definitive military defeat at a place called Dien Bien Phu, which is also there. Look at me, it's as if I've thought these things through. At Dien Bien Phu, which is a tiny outpost, let's go to a map here and we'll take a look at this. Dien Bien Phu is right there. You see that? And to get some perspective, this is Hanoi, and this will ultimately be the demilitarized zone where Vietnam is cut in half. So it's extremely far northwest in the very northern part of Vietnam. It's an outpost, fairly remote, no real strategic value, but the French forces decide to make a stand there, and the Vietnamese lay siege to it for months and months and months. It's a disaster for the French forces. Ultimately, I think it's May the 7th, isn't that right? May the 7th, the Vietnamese defeat the French at Dien Bien Phu, and it's over. And the French are willing to admit, although with some restrictions, the French admit their defeat. At the very same time, the sort of great power states are already involved in a conference at Geneva, the Geneva Conference of 1954. At Geneva, the powers that be, and this involves a number of, the sort of usual suspects in the West, but it also involves China and North Vietnamese, or Vietnamese delegates. At Geneva, the decision is made to cut Vietnam in half. And this is at the 17th parallel, what will be referred to by the Americans as the DMZ. It's pretty much halving the country, although not equally in terms of agriculture and industrial production. The 17th parallel divide is designed to be entirely temporary. It's to establish a cooling off period, and this is the final declaration of the Geneva Accords makes this very, very clear. The two parties, and at this point they are Ho Chi Minh and what's called the Viet Minh, which is M-I-N-H, Viet Minh. This is the army around the communists in Ho Chi Minh. They retreat to the north, and the French forces retreat to the south, and there's to be a cooling off period and kind of a reevaluating and then a recovery. And in 1956, there are to be national elections. Very important. National elections. And what those national elections are to do, as are suggested in the title, national elections, whoever wins those will rule over a unified Vietnam. That's supposed to be the program. So Geneva has really laid out what is a simple solution to ending within 2 years what had been a nightmare for French forces and for the French state, and not a very popular war. So in 1956, for all intents and purposes, this thing will come to an end, and somebody who, they know who at this point, somebody will rule over a united Vietnam and it'll be over. There will be no need for U.S. involvement in Vietnam. That brings us to 1954. And you would think that in 1954, the U.S. wouldn't want to hang around in Vietnam. There's nothing in Vietnam. There's no real mineral resource in Vietnam that the U.S. wants or needs. There's really no strategic value in Vietnam. I mean, other places are vastly more important in the calculus if you kind of use their own framework. Indonesia is more important. Japan is vastly more important, which by 52 is essentially sewn up. It's been rebuilt. But Vietnam, you can't make a case that Vietnam is strategically important. And I don't even think they would have made that case. So it begs the question, why the hell stay on in Vietnam? What's in Vietnam? So I want to see a couple things about what's in Vietnam. First of all, colonialism kind of determines the level of development in a state. The development's kind of loaded up. We'll talk about that word in a few minutes. But the French have no interest, like any colony, any imperial state. The French have no interest in developing Vietnam. The French have no interest in Vietnam becoming a manufacturing center. They have no interest in Vietnam developing all the accoutrements of a modern state, a middle class, a physical infrastructure, none of this stuff. Vietnam, and these are things that are kind of widely known, Vietnam produces rice, rubber, coal. I mean, there are some other commodities that are like cottage industries compared to these. Those are basically it. The rubber and the coal combined now, and almost all of those two are exported. The rubber and the coal account for 5% of Vietnamese exports. 5%. So it's tiny. Absolutely insignificant. Rice is the biggie. Rice is the mainstay. Rice accounts for all the rest, nearly all the rest of the exports. More than 90% of the exports is rice. The French established in Vietnam a very, very effective arrangement. By the 1930s, they've gotten Vietnam so very efficient and effective that Vietnam becomes the second leading rice producer in the entire world. Now, so that'll mean the development of a certain kind of infrastructure. That'll mean certain kinds of rail lines, a little bit of road network, maybe some dredging of canals, a few ports here and there. Nothing more than that. You need a way to get in, get to the rice, get the rice to the ports, get the rice on the market. That's pretty much all you need. There's no need for a more elaborate infrastructure than that. And so in 1954, in the southern half of Vietnam, there's nothing there. During the course of the First Indochina War, much of that infrastructure, albeit meager and very, very limited, had been completely destroyed. I don't have the numbers, and it would just bore the hell out of you if I gave them to you anyway, but like a third of the railroad mileage is completely destroyed. Most of the road network is unusable. Most of the road network is not primary, but it's secondary, which means it's unpaved. So during the monsoon season, you can't get through any of it anyhow. So it isn't as if there's an infrastructure that you can just you can transit all over Vietnam if you like. It isn't the case at all. There's nothing there. And whatever was there was completely disrupted and destroyed during the First Indochina War. All right, so there we are in 1954. That's what exists. That's the reality of southern Vietnam. So it would make much, much more sense if the U.S. had said, let's bag it. The French are willing to admit their defeat. They're already a part of NATO. They've begun their economic recovery. They still have some colonial holdings someplace else. The British are beginning to rebound. We've sewn up Japan. The Korean War has been, there's some sort of a very limited truce there, an armistice there. So it would make sense then if the United States would have just said, let's just pull out of Vietnam. There's no reason to stay in here. It doesn't happen that way, obviously, or we wouldn't be having this talk, and you would never have learned a damn thing about Vietnam, because it wouldn't have been on the radar. It wouldn't have caused the big problem that it caused. In 1954, the United States decides to stay on in Vietnam for reasons that are, I think, very, very poorly understood and almost never written about. I was surprised when I began to do this research that there's almost nothing written about this stuff. And yet there are piles and piles and piles of documents that you can access to figure out what the hell happened. Why is there this shift in policy that is sort of inexplicable? And it's not repeated in a lot of other cases. So for the next couple of minutes, I'm going to talk about this end of colonialism and the problem of, as they see it, underdevelopment, which is there is just that, end of colonialism and underdevelopment in quotes. And I put it in quotes not because it's a loaded term that I want to remove myself from, but it's because it's the term they always use. They don't use undeveloped. They don't use traditional yet. They don't use backward, unless, like later Lyndon Johnson will throw around pissant and backward and that sort of thing. But in the parlance of policymakers and statesmen and economists at the UN and other places, they use underdeveloped. And it's an important term because it's not absent of political meaning. What is an underdeveloped place? If there's an underdeveloped place, then there is a developed place. It's a reference to a specific kind of infrastructure. So policymakers go, and not just policymakers, I'll talk about a couple of people. This is far flung by 1950. They're concerned that there are places in the world that lack the attributes that are found in what are called modern states. And they think it is the absence of those attributes that are going to prevent these places from being able to sort of come under the umbrella of the sort of Western political economy of the world. It's the absence of a certain kind of, I'll talk about some of the details of that. It's the absence of certain attributes that are going to prevent us from being able to get these folks under the umbrella. And they call it underdevelopment. In 1944, and I'll do this briefly because I know Bob has talked at least probably a couple of times about Bretton Woods, but in 1944 in New Hampshire, 44 delegates meet in New Hampshire. 44 delegates. How many great power states are there? Less than half that number. And great power is just a historical term. Great power states refers basically to Russia, Western Europe, the United States. It's the usual suspects again. In Bretton Woods, this is delegates from 44 nations. John Maynard Keynes, it's sort of connoting the complexion of this gathering. John Maynard Keynes called this gathering a monstrous monkey house. He's a great white statesman, or a great white economist, and political thinker. At Bretton Woods, the structures that are set up, the IMF, the World Bank, which have already been dealt with here, the dollar system, dollar and gold system, these structures are designed to deal with this very problem. If you only had your great power neighbors to worry about and they retained all their colonies, you wouldn't need these kind of structures in place. You could all kind of rebuild together and use the colonies to do that, as had been happening for over 100 years. And you just sort of rebuild the old system that the war tore down. But that isn't possible anymore. Bretton Woods is designed to float its currency loans and capital investments to nations that want to rebuild that don't have anything. That's what the Bretton Woods system is about. It's designed to not only put in place, but to help buttress a very different kind of global economy. Now, by the 1940s, this is before the war is even over, they're already thinking about this stuff. There's a very famous economist named Rosenstein Rodin. And I guess I can write his name down for those of you who are writing these things down. Rosenstein Rodin. He's an Oxford economist. Rosenstein Rodin. That's all the last name. First initials are P-N. Rosenstein Rodin. He writes this article called The International Development of Economically Backward Areas, which is a great title. It's back in the old days when the titles would tell you exactly what the hell was being said in the article. And this is what he says. He's also credited with having been the father of what gets called development economics. He says this in 1944, quote, "If we want to ensure a stable and prosperous peace, we have to provide for some international action to improve the living conditions of those people who missed the industrialization bust in the 19th century," unquote. In the United Nations in 1948, the United Nations issues what are called the World Economic Reports, issues scads of these things, roughly annually. In 1948, it spoke of, quote, "the urgent problem of economic development of underdeveloped countries," the underdeveloped term. In 1949 and 50, the report said, its annual report said, the economic development of the underdeveloped countries remains the most important single long-run economic problem confronting the world," unquote. the most important single long-run problem confronting the world is the underdeveloped nature of much of the former colonial world. So, people are aware of this. People know this is dangerous, or at least they perceive it as very dangerous. They perceive what are formerly colonies as very volatile, incapable of leading themselves, incapable of putting together governments or self-governing, and so they need outside help. And so if they need outside help, what is the prescription? Well, they're underdeveloped, so they need to be developed. They need to be made modern. In 1949, in his inaugural address, I don't know if did I put this up here? I did not. In 1949, in Truman's inaugural address, he spoke of a new kind of aid program, and he issues what gets called Point 4 aid. It's just Point 4 is fine, but it's called Point 4 because they're very creative. It's the fourth point he made in the speech. Point 4 aid, and this is what he said. As part of Point 4, Truman said, "The U.S. must embark on a bold new program for making the benefits of our scientific advances and industrial progress available for the improvement and growth of underdeveloped areas." Go in and rebuild them, modernize them. He went on to say, this he said a little bit later, he said, because there was criticism that this is just basically a big handout. We're just handing all this money out to people and we get nothing in return for it. Truman criticized that, saying that isn't the case at all. In fact, quote, "The development of these countries would keep our own industrial plant and business for untold generations," unquote. And that's a telling statement. Truman gets it too. Truman actually, when he announces Point 4, surprises even Dean Acheson, who was kind of his right hand. But Acheson didn't know that he was going to propose such a bold program. Truman gets it. Truman understands what Rosenstein Rodin is saying, what Acheson had earlier said, what others have been saying, what the Bretton Woods system is about. You've got to go in and rebuild these places. You've got to rescue these places, that they're in need of rescue. Now, the people who live in these places aren't going to have the same opinion, and I'll get to them in a second. This is just from the U.S. policy standpoint. They think that now it's the onus is on the United States, with some help from Western European allies, to go in and develop places, to modernize them. The National Security Council issued this report in 1953. They actually didn't publish it. This is an internal document. But I think this is also a very kind of insightful statement from the NSC. This is National Security Council 1953. It says, quote, "Despite the Soviet threat, many nations and societies outside the Soviet bloc are so unsure of their national interests that they are presently unwilling to align themselves with the United States and its allies. Although largely underdeveloped, their vast manpower, their essential raw materials, and their potential for growth are such that their absorption within the Soviet system would greatly, perhaps decisively alter the world balance of power to our detriment. Conversely, their orderly development into more stable and responsible nations, able and willing to participate in the defense of the free world, can increasingly add to its strength." Very, very clear. It's too many words, but very, very clear. Look, there's a ton of manpower and natural resources at stake. They don't understand what their interests are. They don't understand what we're trying to do for them. If we don't do it for them, that manpower and resources will be taken up by the Soviet Union to our detriment. It'll so alter the balance of power in the world that it will perhaps be decisive. It might decisively alter the balance of power. So, and Bob has mentioned this in the past, and I think he's absolutely right. After a certain point, the Cold War really is about nationalism and the disruptive nature of the end of colonialism. The threat here is not necessarily the Soviet Union. The threat is that you've got to come to control all these places. And we're talking about dozens and dozens and dozens of countries who had never existed before, suddenly come into being. In 1960, for example, in just the year 1960, 18 new nations declare independence. In just that year. And this had been happening since 1945. All these new nations coming online. So that you can actually get in Bretton Woods in 44 nations represented. So they perceive this as a tremendous, tremendous problem. And again, it's odd to me that you don't really find much on this stuff. It's clear to me that they're scared of the perils here, but they're excited about the potentials. Now, very quickly, there is, and I meant to put the numbers here, and I guess I did not. There's a rise of foreign aid. You could sort of track this. As there are all these conversations about the underdeveloped world and the chaos and the danger, and we got to do something about it, you could also go and find that you could chart the numbers in rising foreign aid. When Truman introduces Point 4, Truman is roundly criticized. And he's basically criticized by what are called rollbackers, guys like Dulles and maybe Robert Taft from Ohio, Republicans who are saying increased U.S. foreign aid is basically like the New Deal writ large. It's social. It's creeping socialism. We don't want to become the country that issues handouts to the world, basically to help with them, let them fend for themselves. So there's this criticism, pretty staunch criticism from Republicans and from some Democrats who say, this is too much. Now this is really, you're taking the New Deal abroad. This is not what the state ought to be doing. This is not the function of the American government. I think that they kind of don't see the writing on the wall. I'm not a proponent or a critic necessarily of this stuff. I think this is an idea whose time has come. And you see, from 1949, when Truman introduces Point 4, it's pretty much shot down. They issue it in, actually it's a couple of years, maybe it's 1950, 51. It comes out as an act, an International Foreign Aid Act, and it's valued at like $35 million, which Truman had in mind hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, not $35 million. So it's dramatically watered down, and you think, well, Truman's defeated. The idea is defunct. It is not. For example, during the years 1949 to 1952, a very, very narrow time, 49 to 52, 75% of all American aid, economic aid, goes to European countries, right? Tiny little window, 49 to 52, 75% of all U.S. foreign aid, economic aid, goes to European countries. That's about $25 billion, if you're taking names. During the next 5-year set, say 53 to 58, that percentage completely reversed. 75% of all U.S. aid now goes to third world countries. It's a remarkable turn of events. So if you were charting this and you didn't know all this other stuff, you didn't know any history, you didn't read any of this stuff, and you could see this charted, there's $25 billion in aid going to Europe, all these Western European countries. You think, well, that's Marshall Plan, that kind of makes sense. But then immediately in the early 50s, a dramatic turn. The Marshall Plan ends, so there's going to be some significant drop in the chart. But this rise in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, $22 billion goes into Latin America. So the aid percentages just completely shift. What the hell's happening? This is a very significant move. Truman basically won out. Not just Truman, but people who are proponents of increasing foreign aid with the agenda of developing underdeveloped societies. So during the next 5 years, as I said, 75% of U.S. foreign economic aid goes to developing countries. By 1962, this is an astounding figure. By 1962, 90% of all U.S. aid goes to underdeveloped countries. 90% goes to underdeveloped countries. So it's a fairly dramatic turn of events. And you have to ask, where's it going? What's the money being used for? You now have read several chapters of Dave Schmidt. You can begin to guess at where some of this money is going. There are two large categories. There are a lot of little categories, but there are two large categories for U.S. foreign aid. One of those is military aid. So they prop up the likes of Castillo Armas, for example, or any other military junta around the world that Bob has talked about in some detail. So there's a good deal of the foreign aid that goes to military kinds of expenditures. Then the other of these kind of two twin pillars of foreign aid, the other is economic development aid. Economic development aid. It's an odd thing. It's kind of a new thing in the world. Before the Second World War, there was no such thing as economic development aid. There were no development economics. Nobody talked about development or underdevelopment, or traditional or modern, in terms of nation states and the global balance of power. This is a brand new feature of U.S. foreign policy. And now I'm going to talk about, just for a few minutes, what I have here as modernization in quotes and the university and empire. And so I think what I'm trying to explain here is that as there is this shift from huge dollars to European allies, from European allies to the underdeveloped world, we kind of have to explain where that money is going. Why, all of a sudden, is there so much interest in developing the third world or developing the global south? And ultimately, I promise, although you probably can't see it now, but this will lead us to Vietnam. I'm kind of taking the long way home. Modernization. Immediately following the Second World War, at numerous universities in the United States, and I'll abbreviate, I'm not going to give you a list of all these universities, they set up think tanks, basically, research institutes, area studies programs, scads of them all over the place. And they have a direct impact on policy. The federal government essentially, and this is the Pentagon, the CIA, even the FBI, various agencies within the federal government are looking for expertise. You don't just go in and modernize. You don't just go over and plant corn and build a road and leave. So they're looking for expertise. So they begin to kind of manufacture expertise. And just a few examples. There's an entity called the Bureau of Applied Sciences. This is housed at Columbia University, the Bureau of Applied Sciences. There is the Center for International Studies, CNIS, which I'll talk about in a second. That's at MIT. There's the Institute for International Social Research. That's at Princeton. These are big, big, big think tanks, university-based think tanks. Many of these still exist today. CNIS is still around today. There's actually been a proliferation of these things. You can go to any university website and find these things. Just the ones I named. Government funding made up over 75% of all their funding. So there is a real obvious, clear relationship between and a link between the federal government and these think tanks in the Cold War. That's why I put the university and empire. There's a relationship between the university and empire making, although they don't call it that. This is objective and scientific and the like. A lot of academics, a lot of academic intellectuals kind of catch the bug in the 1950s, the modernization development bug. And they are cultural anthropologists, political scientists, economists, historians, scads of people catch the bug and believe that they can offer up solutions based on a deep understanding of the history of economics, a deep understanding of culture, a deep understanding of political science and how governments work. They believe they can then take that knowledge and that expertise into foreign places and basically write for them a program for developing their societies. The Ford Foundation contributes to this. The Ford Foundation actually pays for the what's called the Russian Research Center at Harvard. Pays almost $1 million to help to establish it there. The Carnegie Corporation, actually it's the Carnegie Corporation that pays for the Russian Research Center at Harvard. The Ford Foundation contributes $270 million to 34 different what are called area studies programs. So the funding is plentiful. And prestige accrues, advancement accrues, publication is, opportunities are plentiful for people who are kind of in this pipeline. And there are kind of a short list of heavies that have direct influence on policy. And I'll, let me just, you don't have to jot this stuff down, but let me read a few of the big titles. The product of this often is articles, books, symposia, seminars, think pieces, papers that contribute directly to policy. They're given over to Congress or the CIA. And their titles are very, very telling. And I'll just read a few of the titles of, most of these are books. In 1951, a guy named Edward Shills wrote a book called Toward a General Theory of Action. Walt Rostow in 1952 wrote a book called The Process of Economic Change. Lucian Pye, both Rostow and Lucian Pye are at MIT. Lucian Pye wrote a book called Guerrilla Communism in Malaya, in which he offered solutions for that. That was the problem. Daniel Lerner, this is probably the most popular of all these texts, outside of Rostow's later book. Daniel Lerner wrote a book called The Passing of Traditional Society, which is a great little title, at least to set up as kind of a straw book. Rostow's biggie is 1960. Rostow wrote a book called The Stages of Economic Growth, which becomes highly influential, and he has readers all over the place, from the Senate in the House of Reps to John Kennedy as president. The Stage of Economic Growth. An anti-communist manifesto. That's right. Thank you. Yeah, the subtitle is an anti-communist or a non-communist manifesto. A non-communist manifesto. Rostow had said for years, since 51, 52, his articles and books, he had said somebody needs to write a non-communist manifesto. And so he saw the stages of economic growth as that very thing. And he considers this kind of lays the foundation for how to answer communism. Rostow believed, and I guess I can just talk about this now, what the hell. Rostow believed that if you left these countries alone, they would be ripe for communist subversion, right? Because communists, he believed, and he's not alone in this, he believed that wherever there is poverty and ignorance and backwardness and misery and the like, this is a seedbed for communism. He actually calls it, this is a great, Rostow provides us with so many benefits. Our debt to him is incalculable. Rostow calls communism, I'm a lefty and a upside down one at that, the disease of the transition. The disease of the transition. Isn't that great? The disease of the transition. That's what communism is. It's simplified to the disease of the transition. So it's not its own kind of independent political, economic, organizational method, whatever the hell. It is instead the disease of the transition. What transition? The transition from traditional to modern. In the stages of economic growth, Rostow lays out historically this, and it's amazing to go back and read this now in light of what's happening right now. I swear I can no longer see Donald Rumsfeld without thinking of Walt Rostow. He's so tremendously confident, and he lays out, it's a very, very brief little book, but he lays out historically basically what have been the world problems. Here they are. It has to do with these stages of economic growth. There are, pre-industrial or underdeveloped, pre-industrial, industrial. He goes through all this stages of economic growth, and the very final, the ultimate stage. Which nation do you think is there? The United States, right, where Rostow lives. The ultimate stage of any nation is what he calls high mass consumption. That's the pinnacle. That's the thing to which we are all moving in our lives and in successive generations. The point of high mass consumption. So Rostow believes in this staged process, there are a number of points along this linear path to development at which the disease of communism can enter and disrupt the process. So therefore, you see where this is going. Rostow says we need to really hastily get these places modernized because now the danger is greater than ever. The Soviet Union exists, and then China, and so it's urgent. It's more urgent than ever that we develop these places. These are very, very influential books. Very influential people. They get huge funding to conduct tons and tons of research. They have access to things that most scholars would not have access to. When they organize conferences, big people show up. Policymakers show up. A lot of these people they'd been to Congress, they've been to the White House. Rostow is taken on by Kennedy as a speechwriter. He actually, as a senator, Kennedy solicits Rostow and a guy named Max Millikan, who they co-authored a few things, but he and Max Millikan are solicited by Kennedy to tell Kennedy about the problem of underdevelopment so Kennedy can fashion a new kind of vision of his own foreign policy. So these folks, this is not an indirect thing. These folks are highly influential and highly influenced. It's a two-way street. The things that they write, the products of their research, are very influential to policymakers, but policymakers and the policy agenda is also terribly influential in what they do. To a man, and they're all men, to a man they're anti-communist, and so it's borne out in their work. To expect otherwise is naive. So, the long and short of it is, by the early 1950s at least, there is a very, very fashionable, very visible, and very influential body of scholarship around the idea of modernization. Modernization. All right, one more quote, and I'll try to leave you alone on the quotes. In 1954, Millikan and Rostow write this little essay. They're actually tapped by Allen Dulles as the head of the CIA. Dulles taps these two guys to basically produce a little study paper on this. And they produce a study paper in 1954 called Notes on Foreign Economic Policy. Very simple little piece. And this is what it says. I think this is a great statement. Quote, in the short run, communism must be contained militarily. In the long run, we must rely on the development of an environment in which societies which directly or indirectly menace our own will not evolve. That's great. That's tremendously arrogant, but it's a simple solution. I'll read it again. In the long run, we must rely on the development of an environment in which societies which directly or indirectly menace our own will not evolve. How do you do that? That takes tremendous largesse, all right? That's a huge investment, a huge commitment. Our policy should be the prevention of societies that directly or indirectly menace our own from developing. We oughtn't to allow for an environment in which those kinds of societies can develop. That's got to be the pinnacle of arrogance, to think that you can have that kind of influence. And it's going to be years and years and years before they learn they cannot. And it's actually Vietnam will be the place where they learn there are very real limits on American power. Despite the unavoidable fact that America is the overwhelming superpower during this period, Vietnam will teach very, very real limits on American power. Only slowly, though, unfortunately. So there are a handful of ideas, and I go to the trouble of kind of detailing this stuff because you will see it borne out in Vietnam. And without the background, you may not understand what it's all about. I know I did not. There are a handful of ideas about this stuff around which there is pretty much a rock-solid consensus. And I'll tick these off. There are like 4 of them. First, all nations develop along a kind of linear path. All nations develop. Every nation begins as traditional and will end up at modern. This is a truism. Everybody accepts this. So your path along the line, whatever your current situation is, it just defines the state, right? Where you've come from and where you're headed. I mean, there's no empirical evidence to suggest any of this stuff is real, but nevertheless it is taken on faith. The second thing, this is Rostow's kind of ending statement. All nations will end up at the same point. If enough time is allowed, if the right kind of policy is worked out, all nations will end up at the same point of modernism. The third thing is the degree of societal backwardness can be effectively measured by using the West. That's the benchmark. The degree of societal backwardness can be gauged by using the West as your framework. It makes sense, right? Rostow's not going to use, whatever, Yemen as it's going to use the United States. It's going to use a society of which he's a product. Been very, very good to him. And finally, and this is the key, right? All the other stuff isn't necessarily policy. They're just observations. This is the policy. The fourth thing is the modernization process can be sped up. Yeah, that is, you can kind of force development on nations. With the right kind of policies, you can make this stuff happen. You can bring about modernity. You can modernize nations. Or not some places that aren't even really nations. You can modernize what were formerly colonial areas. Yes, sir. Can you use the mic?
Do they think that modernization will develop by itself without assistance if left to go?
That's a good question. They tend to think that it's been disrupted now, and because of colonialism, nation states, or not nation states, former colonial areas don't have the wherewithal. That's why they need the help, right? They're kind of on their knees. They've been battered down by, in some cases, 100-odd years of colonialism. And so they need now this infusion of capital and technicians and the like in order to get to a point where they can then, what Rostow calls the takeoff point. And Kennedy uses that in his speeches, the takeoff point. Rostow believes they'll need certain help from the West, from the United States, in order to reach the takeoff point or achieve the takeoff point. But beyond a certain point, they all believe they will take off. The attempt is just to kind of control. There'll be some development one way or the other. They want to channel that development in ways that will be consistent with the kind of world they'd like to see unfold, in which societies that directly or indirectly menace our own will not evolve. Yeah?
To what degree were there concerns about developing countries that would be competitors with U.S. production?
Well, if development is done right, there won't be. See, if you develop them right, what is this going to mean? Ultimately, this is going to mean you put in place certain mechanisms that guarantee there'll be open, liberal societies, open to things like private investment, open to multilateral trade, right? I mean, they're not going to develop states that have only bilateral trade agreements or protectionist policies. They're not going to develop states that do that. They're going to develop states that are going to ultimately be in accord with the kind of world they want to create. That's it. That's what I said. You can't divorce this from politics. This is a political thing. Underdevelopment, modernization, nation building. It's all very political. It's not pure science. It's development with an agenda. It's altering colonies, states. It's altering them to serve ultimately some sort of a fairly well-defined purpose. So that, they're not about to develop states that will then, holy hell, those two got out of hand and they went socialist anyhow. It's not going to happen.
I meant more in the sense of, I'm sure they don't want countries in China having huge automobile industries that are exporting everywhere where Ford is sitting on a stockpile of cars, and in that sense, I mean, was there a concern about that, or did they think
It's so early in the game, nobody's thinking Vietnam's going to produce cars. I mean, really.
In a larger sense, the idea of modernization is that Ford will have those
Right, that's right. That's right. That's private investment, right? That you would make them.
well, it's not even like a country. It's these guys. I think are, and found on this, you're dealing with kind of, I think, class interest rather than nation interest. I mean, so if Ford or IT&T or UFCO, has that market, that's fine. That works for everybody. And that's the idea behind modernization, is to create the kind of a society that can embrace these companies. Because if they're backward and poor, then no one's going to buy a car. You need to create.
Yeah, right. I mean, you can't sell refrigerators and typewriters in Vietnam. So and I have very purposefully kind of painted this in the way that they would see it, and I do that. I kind of set it up like that so that we can see how it actually works, and we'll see how it actually works. This is not how it works. Their plans are kind of pie in the sky, and actually, you could use Rostow as the best example of how this doesn't work. Rostow is the most influential book, the Stages of Growth book, and Rostow you would think is a big advocate of modernization schemes and economic development. By the early 60s, Rostow is the biggest hawk. He's the biggest proponent of heavy military involvement in Vietnam because he can't bring it about otherwise. So I think, hang on a minute and I'll get there, but where I'm going with this, we'll see that modernization becomes something quite different than how I've sort of portrayed it so far. They don't intend for these people, for these nations to ultimately be global competitors. Absolutely not. I think what they're doing is answering a problem, and the problem is global instability. You know what I mean? I think that they see that's the crisis. And I haven't really dealt with this much, I'm going to now, but the rise of nationalism. I mean, if you just had, you sort of removed the colonial shackles and you just had absolutely leaderless collections of people, that's not nearly as threatening an environment as what really happened. And that is, you remove the shackles of colonialism and you have the rise of serious nationalist movements, guerrilla movements, insurgencies, and the like. Serious, committed nationalists who want national independence, sovereignty for their countries. That's a much more dangerous set of circumstances. Because you get, unlike the old balance of power system, which basically cut the world into some large chunks, now you get tiny little spheres every place. You get competitive spheres all over. You get multiple spheres in Asia, multiple spheres in Africa, all over the place. That's a much more chaotic environment. So what if you don't do anything? This is what I call the danger of doing nothing. The danger of doing nothing, as far as they see it, is nationalism. Nationalism, neutralism. Neutralism, I don't know if Bob mentioned this or not, but Dulles, I think it was at a press conference, Dulles called neutralism immoral and short-sighted. He said that's an immoral and short-sighted position. It's immoral for people to be neutral. And Dulles, very typically, Dulles is deeply devout and sees these as kind of, in apocalyptic terms, sees the global circumstances in apocalyptic terms. John, Secretary of State. Yeah.
I know you're going to talk about ZM later, but another problem you have with these modernization is that the states targeted don't see it the same way. So when this American largesse floods in, these, we've talked about this before, that these people to whom it's directed aren't democratically elected leaders for the most part, and so they're going to take that and rather than develop their country, build hydroelectric plants, or they're going to use it to build a military which can support their own role. So the U.S. ends up supporting really the most repressive states under the banner of modernization in the Cold War era.
Yeah, you're giving away my last chapter, but yeah. Yeah, ultimately, we'll see where this goes. I'm kind of laying a lot of background on you here.
But we've already talked about this with regard to Iran and Indonesia.
Right, yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
If you look at the Shah or Castillo Armas or Suharto.
And that's what I was going to deal with at this point and you already have.
We've already talked about that.
Effectively, but nationalism, that's the danger. Nationalism, that's the one kind of free variable. It's the thing you can't control adequately. You can have great modernization schemes and tremendous capital investment, really profound ideas, but nationalists are not going to accept necessarily the schemes that you unload on them.
And what really monkey wrenches it is right-wing nationalism.
Oh, right,
which
absolutely.
Is what really, these guys have the ultimate leverage.
This is the thing that you hear policymakers are really complaining about, as the 1950s become the 1960s, is they can't make these guys develop. They can't make these guys reform. They can't make these guys create for themselves a tax base, a middle class, a work. They can't do any of this stuff. They won't do it.
And since they're anti-communist, they can't oust them like they did Arbenz
Actually, that happens in Indonesia. That's in Indonesia in the late 1950s. The U.S. moves in and gets a group of rebel officers to try and overthrow Sukarno. Ultimately, the State Department informs the administration, look, you are basically causing a civil war, and you're really pitting two anti-communist groups against each other. This is stupid. And immediately they reverse course and restore aid to the government they've been trying to overthrow for several years.
And actually,
it's a disaster.
Totally not necessarily irrelevant, but the U.S. and Indonesia actually funds a right-wing Muslim group. It was kind of like a pre-modern Al-Qaeda. In order to take on Sukarno. But this is the links to which modernization will go.
Allies of convenience throughout the entire period.
I mean, I'm stealing your thunder, but it's really a self-defeating policy.
It undermines itself. That's part of my argument in my research, is that really you can see in critical ways this contains the seeds of its own undermining, the seeds of its own failure. Let me briefly mention, I got a few minutes here, something he's also talked about briefly, the non-aligned movement. This is again kind of the danger of doing nothing. What happens if you don't do anything? In 1955, there is what's called the Benden Conference, Bandung. Did I put it up here? I did, sure did. Nationalism, Neutralism, Non-Alignment, the Benden Conference. At the Benden Conference, there are dozens of leaders from non-great power states. This is not a meeting of the minds of the sort of the old imperial system, the usual suspects. This is a whole new gathering of people. And it's held in Indonesia in the spring. This is in April of 1955. And the current leader of Indonesia is a guy named Ahmed Sukarno, whose name I think you had on a previous outline. Sukarno gives the kind of opening address at this meeting. And I'll read, it's kind of a lengthy passage, but I think it's useful to see kind of where their heads are at and how they perceive themselves in the world. This is Sukarno. Quote, "As I survey this hall and the distinguished guests gathered here, my heart is filled with emotion. This is the first intercontinental conference of colored peoples in the history of mankind. It is a new departure in the history of the world that leaders of Asian and African peoples can meet together in their own countries to discuss and deliberate upon matters of common concern. Only a few decades ago, it was frequently necessary to travel to other countries and even other continents before the spokesmen of our peoples could confer. I hope that this conference will give more than understanding only and goodwill only. I hope that it will falsify and give the lie to the saying of one diplomat from far abroad," and he quotes somebody else here, "We will turn this Asia-African conference into an afternoon tea meeting. I hope that it will give evidence that Asia and Africa have been reborn, nay, that a new Asia and a new Africa have been reborn," and there's thunderous applause and the like. And I think that's very insightful. It's instructive to kind of figure out where these guys are at. Sukarno is saying, a new day has dawned. You don't have to pursue one of the other policies. You don't have to go into the camp of the Soviet Union or the United States. You can pursue this neutralist policy. Now consider, this guy, and the whole meeting is like this, but Sukarno is jazzed about this possibility. He's jazzed about the possibility of linking third world peoples who couldn't even confer before. There were no venues for meetings of colonial peoples. Oh, it's the semi-annual Colonial Peoples Conference. I mean, there's none of that kind of stuff. And now Sukarno is saying, he and others are jazzed that for the first time in the history of mankind, we are now holding what are specifically and explicitly a conference of non-aligned third world countries, although they don't call themselves third world that I know of. But nevertheless, this is a departure in the history of global affairs. And so, at the same time, you can sort of contrast that with Dulles saying it's immoral and short-sighted to be neutral. And Sukarno doesn't see it that way. Sukarno doesn't see it as immoral. In fact, he sees it as a path toward independence, to sovereignty, to self-respect. It's nationalism. And this is the thing, I won't go into detail on these, but Bob has talked about in detail Iran, Guatemala, a bit on Indonesia, Egypt, and there are so many of these cases. This is what, from the U.S. perspective, this is what is so dangerous about doing nothing. And to them, to the people involved, it's not that dangerous at all. It's actually an exciting dawning of a new era. And you get the clash of these two. And so the U.S. embarks on a very different kind of program to try and win over the allegiance of people. And it has to do with modernization, economic development. Now, I've taken a really circuitous route to get here, but that's the background I think that is needed in order to understand. Now I ask you, what does the U.S., I told you all this stuff about southern Vietnam. In 1954, the Geneva Conference comes to an end. Vietnam is cut in half. There's nothing of any strategic value. The place is torn asunder. There is a vibrant nationalist movement, a powerful insurgency, obviously, that just defeated the French. It costs you nothing to move out. Nothing. This has not made the headlines in any paper yet. No presidency has been ruined on Vietnam. There's nothing there. Why not get out? Now you can begin to see why not, right? Modernization, economic development, the threat of neutralism, nationalism. Now they stay on in Vietnam. This is a critical decision, a terrible one, but a critically important decision. The U.S. is going to stay on in Vietnam. And they're going to proceed to ignore hundreds and hundreds of years of Vietnamese history. When they come into a divided Vietnam, right? They come in 54. In fact, they don't come in, they don't leave. They're already there jointly with the French. The French are, I think all the French expeditionary forces leave in like 56 or late 55. And so then it's just the U.S. The U.S. is there. Actually, during the Geneva Conference, the U.S. was paying particular attention to whatever conclusions that conference wrote up or published. Officially, the U.S. is not a signatory to the declarations at Geneva, and they're purposefully so. They're very standoffish. They're there, but they don't want to be any part of it because they don't want to be bound by whatever restrictions are imposed at Geneva. So, for example, when Geneva says, we're going to partition temporarily Vietnam in half, we're going to partition, and then 56 we're going to have elections and unify Vietnam. The U.S. isn't necessarily beholden to that because it's not a signatory. The U.S. didn't participate. When the Geneva Conference says, and it does, that you cannot accept none of these states. It's called the Free State of Vietnam, and then there's Cambodia Laos. I think there's an umbrella of protection per Geneva that includes Vietnam, but doesn't really terribly well define what Vietnam is exactly. Cambodia and Laos are very well defined, and at least officially given their independence. What it says, though, the Geneva Declaration says, none of these nations can participate in military pacts. None of them can accept overt outside military aid. So now all of those, right, elections in 56, no outside military aid, and no participation in outside pacts, all of those would have undercut American policy over the next 3 years from 54, because the U.S. does every one of them. The U.S. involves Vietnam in a pact, which it's not supposed to. It uses different language, so it's allowed. It makes it it stretches it into what is legal. The U.S. begins to send in overtly military aid, and the Chinese do the same thing with respect to northern Vietnam, although it's meager at this point. So the U.S. at Geneva is purposefully standoffish because they know that the declaration is not going to accord with what they want. They already know in early 54, that they're going to stay on in Vietnam. And they do this for all the reasons I've kind of outlined here. Now, what you read this in the papers and the documents, you read overwhelmingly anti-communism. Anti-communism, anti-communism, anti-communism. It's Ho Chi Minh and the damn communists, and Ho Chi Minh's a puppet of both the Soviet Union and the Chinese. They can't decide which exactly is the more influential. In reality, there are these much, much more important, more salient kind of features of the genesis of American foreign policy. The anti-communism kind of is what it is, and you all know very well what that is. I think the real nut of it is this kind of underlying theme of creating a different kind of world and undermining the threat of nationalism, which would create so much more chaos. So, what do they find in 1954? In the southern half, now remember, this is just the southern half of what was formerly a colony. Vietnam has been denied its independence twice now, in 45 and in 54. So it hasn't really had its independence in the 20th century. What do they find when they go to Vietnam? Well, this is the federal government, I don't know what arm of it, but they issued national intelligence estimates. I don't know, who is it NSC who issues these things, National Intelligence Estimates? In 54, they issue one, and they said, and it says this, quote, the situation in southern Vietnam was likely to continue to deteriorate progressively over the next year. And that the folks in Saigon, quote, would likely seek unification with the North, even at the expense of communist domination. If the scheduled national elections are held, the Viet Minh will almost certainly win, unquote. This is the intelligence estimate. The situation ain't good. If left to their own devices, the people in the South will find some accommodation with the North. Imagine now if somebody came in after the Second World War and cut the U.S. in half. You guys been fighting, it's Civil War. You guys been fighting for a really long time. Retreat to your respective corners in whatever, in Biloxi and New Hampshire. Cool off for 2 years and we're going to have national elections. It makes good sense, does it not, that over the course of those 2 years there would be tremendous overtures crossing the Mason-Dixon line So that by 56, there would be some accord. It would be ready to accommodate each other. The same thing happens in Vietnam. By 56, this is what the intelligence estimate is saying. If left alone, the South will accommodate the North, and they will unify the country by themselves. And if there are elections, if the elections are held today, or in 55, or in 56, the Viet Minh, which is the communist Ho Chi Minh, will no doubt win. Ho Chi Minh is kind of the George Washington of Vietnam. It's not an exaggeration. They're immensely popular. They're very able resistance fighters, and their nationalist credentials are beyond reproach because they ousted the French. So that's what the intelligence finds. Mike Mansfield. Anytime I get a chance to read this quote from Mike Mansfield, I take advantage of it. It's fantastic. And Mansfield is kind of an old hand. Mansfield becomes, in my view anyway, in the Senate, he's the expert in the 50s and into the 60s. Nobody knows more than Mansfield about this stuff. He's a senator from Montana, isn't it? Senator Mike Mansfield, and this is what he says. He's in Vietnam in late in 54, and he files countless reports back to Washington. This is what Mansfield said. He said, Saigon, quote, seethed with intrigue and counter-intrigue, with rumor and counter-rumors. With the political plotting goes on in army circles, government circles, foreign circles, in party headquarters and police headquarters, even in the demi-monde of ill-disguised gangsters, pirates, and extortionists. Isn't that fantastic? Even in the demi-monde of ill-disguised gangsters, pirates, and extortionists. So what does Mansfield find in southern Vietnam? It's a nightmare. There's no political structure. There's no government. There's this demi-monde of ill-disguised gangsters, pirates, I have to repeat it, and extortionists. Mansfield says there's nothing on which, and I know the longer report because I've read it too many times to count. Mansfield goes on to say, there is no basis for the establishment of a government here. And in the final paragraph of his paper, this is where it gets kind of inconsistent, Mansfield recommends not withdrawing from southern Vietnam. Mansfield says, the time is now. We've got to move in. And he says, the only hope, did I put Ziem's name up here? Yeah, I did. First item right here. The only hope in this desperate situation is Ngo Dinh Diem. Yes, ma'am.
Who is Mansfield again?
Mike Mansfield is a senator from Montana, a liberal, a Democratic senator, a terribly influential guy. So Ngo Dinh Diem is the guy who Mansfield says, look, if you're going to do anything, if you're going to salvage what is a desperate, terrible situation, you're going to have to send lots and lots of aid to this guy. Mike Mansfield. I'm pointing the wrong way according to that, aren't I?
Talk a little bit about the Ngo family, Ziem's background.
Sure. That's what I was going to do now, set up the selection of Ziem. Ziem is sort of an interesting fellow. Ziem, when he's appointed to become the head of this new project, this experiment, Ziem is found in New Jersey. Ziem is, by all accounts, kind of a slippery guy, but the one thing that he has that is of value to U.S. officials who are making these decisions is that he is rabidly anti-communist. He's also a Catholic, which is good for people like Mansfield and John Kennedy and Francis Cardinal Spellman, and what gets called, there's a Vietnam lobby, which is kind of ill-defined group of highly influential, high-profile figures who are advocates of supporting Ziem. And they are Francis Cardinal Spellman, John F. Kennedy, Mike Mansfield. There are a number of figures who are in pretty good positions to influence policy.
Catholic
like
Church
Ziem.
actually bankrolls much of it.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I mean, Ziem relies on all kinds of, the kindness of all kinds of not-so-strange strangers. But Ziem is chosen as a Catholic to go over and rule in what is overwhelmingly a Buddhist country, although Keith Taylor would disagree with that position. Vietnam is overwhelmingly Buddhist. Even the very conservative numbers say 80%. Ziem is a Catholic. He's a good anti-communist. He is put in position, this is in June 54 they make this decision. I think the final declaration is just weeks earlier from the Geneva Conference. By June, he's on the ground in southern Vietnam. He's in Saigon, and immediately there begins this huge effort to build around Ziem all the accoutrements of a state. Now the leaders in that state are going to be, they're going to call it South Vietnam ultimately, but Mansfield doesn't use that term yet. Ziem and Ziem's brothers, there's Ngo Dinh Con, Ngo Dinh Nhu, who Nhu is the most influential. Most of the government positions go out to family members. When Ziem picks what's called a National Assembly, which is kind of the equivalent of a Congress, a parliamentary body, he picks, I think there are 123 or 4 candidates. Ziem handpicks 90 of them. He's also got what is the equivalent of kind of a cabinet around him. I think there are 7 or 8 positions in that, and there are 5 or 6 of those are all family. So in 1954, the U.S. makes the decision to set up in southern Vietnam a brand new state that has no historical foundation and that has no physical foundation whatsoever. Nevertheless, this begins the long, hard slog of American policy that is ultimately going to lead to the Second Indochina War, the American war in Vietnam. And I am out of time. We'll resume in a few minutes.